Hey there! Hi! Why am I here? What are we doing? Is reality a construct? Are we governed by a malicious God who lies to us? Or am I perceiving the void appropriately, but I'm only perceiving in a void-like manner? I don't know the answers to these questions. It seems that I don't know anything anymore. Now, I am here, clearly not dressed for the part, because my last Chapter 10 lecture that I recorded for you has been rejected by the YouTube gods. I have been struck down. Struck down. That's supposed to be a lightning bolt. I have been struck by the YouTube gods who have struck me down, and they accused my last video of a violation of copyright law. That's 100% true. My last YouTube video that I recorded, and I recorded it for Chapter 10, has been shut down by YouTube because I dared to play a Saturday Night Live clip to try to illustrate a point I was making. So that apparently is a violation of copyright law. I don't want to be in violation of copyright law. I imagine YouTube doesn't want to be sued by NBC Universal. So as a result, here I am back, like I said, clearly not dressed for the part, re-recording a lecture that I've already recorded, in the off chance that you have a decent understanding of what the U.S. presidency is all about. Oh, but that's okay. We must soldier on, as frustrating as these things may be. So with no further ado, let's continue our conversation on the second unit. Our first conversation was over Chapter 9, a big fat conversation on Congress, a really, really important chapter. This one's really important too, because now that we have finished talking about the first branch of government, now we get into the conversation about the second branch of government. Once again, and the second branch of government is, of course, the executive branch. And the executive branch has lots of moving parts. Actually, so many moving parts that we take the executive branch and we turn it into two separate chapters. The first of those chapters is Chapter 10. But aside from Chapter 10, we will also have a conversation on the executive branch even further in Chapter 11. We'll get there when we get there. For now, though, when we're talking about the president, of course, we're talking about the executive branch, which, do you remember? Do you remember from our conversation earlier this semester which article of the Constitution talks about the executive branch? The answer, of course, feel free to pause me if you need to think about your answer or look it up. But the answer, of course, is Article 2. Now, if you don't already know what all three branches do, once again, I've said this a couple times, but I'm really going to reinforce it in your brain here. Make sure you know what all three branches do. The legislative branch makes the laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. We'll talk about what that means to enforce the laws. Because, I mean, we'll talk about that more in Chapter 11. Because, I mean, clearly the president isn't Batman. He's not putting on a cape and a mask and enforcing the law at night. So who is doing the law enforcement for the federal government? We'll talk about that more thoroughly in Chapter 11. Now, I've asked you this before, and I'll ask you again. Would you like to serve in government as a person in Congress, or relevant to this chapter, would you like to be president? Well, the answer is you probably can't be, because most of you are probably going to be under the age of 35. I know a few of us are what we call non-traditionals, over the age of 35. I'm way over the age of 35. But that does mean that you got to be at least 35 if you want to be president. Right now, we have a president that is more than twice that age in Joe Biden. And previous to him, we had a president more than twice that age in Donald Trump. So here in America right now, we're trending towards the geriatric in terms of president. But this is not the only requirement. You also have a lesser known requirement. You have to have lived in America for 14 years of your life. Now, the Constitution does not specify which 14 years that is. So theoretically, you can be born here in America, move out of America when you're 15 to like Italy or something, and you're still good to run for president. Matter of fact, you could run for president from Italy if you want. And I don't know if there's a law that says the president has to live in America while he's president. So theoretically, you could be president from Italy, I think. I don't think that would work, but you could do it, I think. Now, of course, the requirement we're all pretty well aware of when it comes to the president is the fact, is a unique requirement that we ask nobody else in government to fulfill. And that's, you have to be not a citizen, a natural-born citizen. It's not enough to be a citizen, a natural-born citizen. What does natural-born mean? Because this is the exact phrase the Constitution uses and doesn't explain. For the record, we technically don't know what it means. Technically, we don't know what it means because the Supreme Court has never weighed in on it, has never defined what means natural born. What I thought growing up means you have to be born on American soil. So in the 50 states, or in an embassy somewhere in the world, or in a military base. Maybe you remember John McCain ran for president in 2008, the late John McCain. John McCain was born in Panama. How was he able to run for president? Well, because he was born on a military base, which is considered U.S. soil. Now, that's what I thought natural-born citizen means. But then 2016 happens, and Mr. Green Eggs and Ham himself, over here, Ted Cruz, runs for president despite the fact that he's not born in America. He was born in Canada. How is that possible? Ted Cruz attempts to explain.
Will you please justify constitutionally your legal right to be President of the United States as it relates to your natural-born status?
Sure, I'm happy to, Julie. Thank you for that question. The law under the Constitution and federal law has been clear from the very first days of the Republic. The child of a U.S. citizen born abroad is a natural-born citizen. What the Constitution requires is for anyone to be president, they have to be a natural-born citizen. So if you or I travel abroad and we have a child overseas, that child is a U.S. citizen by virtue of birth. That's true if you have service members are traveling abroad, if they're defending this country. That's why John McCain was a natural-born citizen, even though he was born in Panama, because his parents were U.S. citizens. That's why George Romney, Mitt Romney's dad, was a natural-born citizen, even though he was born in Mexico when his parents were Mormon missionaries. And so the law is straightforward. Indeed, the very first Congress, which consisted of many of the framers of the Constitution, the authors of the Constitution, wrote the very first laws on citizenship, and they explicitly defined the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad as a natural-born citizen. Now,
that is a explanation that he provided, and what he is arguing there is that you don't have to be born on American soil. You can be born anywhere, but as long as you're born by American citizens, then you're a natural-born citizen. Now, for the record, since he made this statement, of course his presidential run didn't work out for him, but since he made this statement, several presidential scholars were polled, not presidential, but constitutional scholars were polled about his explanation here, and 60% of them agreed with Ted Cruz. They said that that is the actual meaning of natural-born citizen, but 40% disagreed. 40% disagreed. So there is disagreement over exactly what that phrase means. I'm not asking you to know what it means. I'm just asking you to be aware that you need to be a natural-born citizen. Some requirements to be president that you already know. One of those is, of course, the fact that you can only serve 2 terms. There you go. You can only serve 2 terms, and you can serve them 4 years at a time, of course. You're probably aware of that requirement. It's 2021. That does mean that Joe Biden will likely be running for re-election in 2024. All right, so let's take some time to talk about presidential duties. And I'm not going in the textbook on this one. I'm not talking about like, you got to be chief diplomat, stuff like that. No. When I'm talking about presidential duties, I'm talking about what does Article 2 of the Constitution say? What specific powers does it grant the president? Turns out it grants the president 7 specific powers. Some of these powers you're aware of, some of them you might not be aware of. And a couple of these powers is really, you see the Constitution grapple with the fact that they're giving the president too much power on a couple of these. So while they give the president a power, they also give a check on that power at the same time. So let's work our way through this. Presidential duty number 1, he is the chief executive. That means he is the person that runs the executive branch. As we've said before, the executive branch enforces the law. He is essentially in charge of that process. That does mean that enforcement of the law can be very different from president to president. I'll give you an example. Joe Biden hasn't been president very long, so forget him. But Donald Trump and Barack Obama were both president, and they both operated their presidencies under the exact same immigration laws. The immigration laws did not change one comma from Obama to Trump. And yet enforcement of immigration was extremely different between the two of them. I don't know which approach you prefer, but nonetheless, they were very different. And that's because despite these laws say you got to do this, you got to do that, the laws give the executive branch, and chiefly the president, a ton of wiggle room. A ton of wiggle room to enforce the law this way or that way, really however they see fit. So that is a very key responsibility, because the government will just enforce laws differently based on who the president is. They are not all going to enforce the law the same. Now, power number 2, you're probably aware of already. The president is commander-in-chief. That means he bosses the military around. Duh, right? I mean, you already know this. You knew this before you took this class, that the president is in charge of the military. But let's not underestimate the power of that, because we elect the president. We, the citizens, elect the president. That does mean that there's civilian leadership of the military. The military is not its own operation. It marches to the drumbeat of us via the president that we've elected. Now, that's a big deal, because in some countries, let's not take that for granted, in some countries they don't have that. In some countries the military kind of is its own independent agency. And this has happened in Egypt. Egypt has a democratically elected government and a independent military. And what happened a few years back is the military did not like the democratically elected government that the Egyptian people elected, and they overthrew the government. So right now, at least as of 2021, Egypt is a military dictatorship, what we call a junta, which is spelled with a soft J. You don't need to know that or anything, but it's a junta. And what that means is, once again, the military runs the country. So let's not take for granted the fact that our Constitution grants the military civilian leadership. Now, an obscure power of the president, it is in there in the Article 2. It is in there, but an obscure power of the president is the ability to convene and adjourn Congress. He can convene and adjourn Congress. He can force them to gather. He can force them to go away. And he really only does this for emergencies, is primarily why he does it. He can also do it for big fancy speeches that he gives to Congress, something called the State of the Union. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. Convenes and adjourns Congress. Okay, not a lot of people know he has that ability, but he can do that in emergencies. Now, power number 4 you're probably familiar with. Even if Congress chooses to pass legislation, the president can single-handedly shut it down with what we call a veto. And veto is a significant power of the president. He can single-handedly kill legislation. This is kind of the first instance where you see the Constitution, the authors of the Constitution grapple with how much power they're giving the president. Because that's probably too much power to give one person. Because if everybody in America wants something, but this one person we've elected doesn't want it, he can kill it with a veto. That seems like too much power. So as a result, we give Congress the ability to override the president. We talked about this in Chapter 9. We give Congress the ability to override the president, but it does take 2/3. It does take 2/3. So you need 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. And it is rare. It doesn't happen very often. It happens like once a presidency. Happened once to Trump, happened once to Obama, happened once to Bush. So in your lifetime, it's really only happened once a presidency. This is not very common, this override here. Vetoes, you'll get a handful of those every presidency. All right, now, in addition to that, you also have the 5th power of the president, the power to make, I actually forgot. That's what happens when I have to give the same lecture 2 times in a row. I get a little brain dead. Anyways, let's talk about line item vetoes. These are not mentioned in your textbook. But when we talk about line item vetoes, it's important that we understand what the Constitution is. It's important that we understand what the veto is. It's what I'm trying to tell you with my mouth. Okay? So anyways, let me draw you a tree. Behold, a gorgeous, does that look like a maple tree? Whatever. Little cartoon tree that I have drawn. If this tree represents a bill trying to get its way through Congress, it has worked its way through Congress, now it's on the president's desk. The president can sign it, which means he allows the entire tree to stand, even if there are some branches on the tree he doesn't particularly like. He likes the tree as a whole. Or he can veto it. And vetoing means Vetoing means there. Vetoing means you cut the entire tree down. You are cutting, even if there are some branches on it that you like, the tree as a whole goes down. That's what signing or vetoing a bill is. You either let the entire tree stand or you cut the entire tree down. That's what the veto is. Now, a line item veto was an attempt by Bill Clinton in the 90s with the cooperation of Congress to get like a partial veto, where instead of cutting down the entire tree, you just saw off a couple branches and allow the rest of the tree to stand. We call that a line item veto. You're only vetoing part of a bill and allowing the rest of it to stand. Now, Congress gave Bill Clinton this power. He said he wanted to use it to eliminate pork from the laws, and that, you know, hey, that's a noble enterprise. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court ruled that he does not have the ability to line item veto. Line item vetoes are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court argued that a line item veto is effectively editing a bill. And editing a bill is essentially writing a bill, so says the Supreme Court. And the president can't write laws. He can't make laws. Only Congress can make laws. So as a result, line item vetoes get a little too close to lawmaking and therefore are unconstitutional. Power number 6. Power number 6 is the power number 5. I'm losing my mind in the void. That's what happens when you're in a soundproof booth with only your face staring back at you. Anyways, power number 5 is appointment power. Appointment power. This allows the president to staff the government with his people. There are several thousand, I thought there was like 4,000 or 5,000, but I just read the other day there's like 7,000 of these positions in the federal government. Keep in mind there are millions of people in the federal government, but only like the top several thousand, I'm going to say 4,000 or 5,000. The top 4,000 or 5,000 are so important they require the president to appoint somebody to that position. Obviously, this is a very large undertaking of the president, and you're essentially staffing the government with your people. That is very important, though, because at the end of the day, we want the president to succeed, right? We want the president to be successful. It takes us a long time to elect the president. It doesn't make any sense to have him be staffed by a government of people that don't like him or don't support him. It makes sense if we allow him to pick his own people to maximize his chances of being successful, whatever success may mean. Now, for the record, that is also a lot of power to give one guy, the power to essentially remake the government in your image. So as a result, despite the fact there's several thousand people the president can appoint, the top 1,000 or so require Senate approval because obviously they're just so consequential. We're talking about people that direct our wars, people that negotiate peace settlements, people that run our education system. These positions are so important that they require Senate approval. Now, on top of that, now let's get to power 6, shall we? The president has the ability not to make war. You would be forgiven if you thought that that's the power the president has. That constitutionally, Congress has the ability to declare war, not the president, even though every president in your lifetime has largely blown past that as if it wasn't a restriction at all. It's a freaking mess, our war-making powers here in America. Anyways, when it comes to ending wars and ending hostilities, the power of treaty making is the president's alone. Nobody else can negotiate treaties, only the president. Okay? And of course his designated people can negotiate treaties. Now, the last treaty we had was during the Obama administration. Obama and Russia reached a treaty to reduce each country to reduce their nuclear stockpiles by 1/3 each country. Both countries kind of weaseled out of that treaty under Putin and Trump, so they kind of weaseled away from that over time. But nonetheless, this is the treaty-making power. And again, there's a lot of power to give one guy the ability to talk to a foreign adversary and say, hey, we're cool now, right? That's a lot of power to give one guy. So the Constitution requires that any treaty be subject to 2/3 ratification by the Senate. 2/3 ratification. Now, the seventh power of the president is the ability to grant pardons, or as the textbook says, reprieves, pardons, and commutations. We'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, what is a pardon? Pardon oftentimes is believed to be a get-out-of-jail-free card. That is not accurate. It's more powerful than a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not only does a pardon get you out of jail for free, on top of that, it wipes your conviction from the face of the earth. It's like you were never convicted. It's like you were never convicted. So that's a wipe your conviction off the face of the earth for free. So pardons are really, really powerful. And for the record, presidents come under fire for using the pardon power sometimes. It's been a while. There were some controversial pardons here or there under Trump. There was controversial pardons under every president. But it gets really controversial when you start looking at at some of the pardons from the 90s under Bill Clinton. So allow me to take a moment to pull up a screen here. Right here. Allow me to pull up the screen. This is the Justice Department's own website. This is the Justice Department's own website. And they provide a list of all the pardons granted under the Clinton administration. There were not that many pardons under Trump. There were not that many pardons under Obama or Bush. Under Clinton, though, I mean, you can scroll down this site yourself and look at it. But look at the top corner here. Look at this scroll box. You see this scroll box? You see how small it is? Look at all the pardons granted under the Clinton administration. I mean, it's just a massive list. At the very top here, you can click on the days in which they were granted. You can kind of see me a little bit in here. Hello. Anyways, right here, you can see all the different days. You can go to a day like February 19th. You know, you can go down to, and you can just read through any of these if you want. Now, most of these pardons you're going to see are for convictions from the 1980s and 1970s. That makes a lot of sense. Bill Clinton is president in the 90s, right? So he's essentially the president of the 90s. And he's going to pardon people for importation of marijuana, for unauthorized sale of government property, for a mutiny. You can making a mutiny, income tax evasion. Let me scroll down a little bit. Let's stop here. Cocaine possession, false statements, lying to a federal officer, embezzlement of government funds, more cocaine right up here, filing a false tax return, bank robbery. Okay, so there's a lot of these different, you can stop anywhere, and they're all fascinating. And of course, I'm an insane person, so I've gone through this entire list. And this to this day is still my favorite one right here. This guy is Raymond Philip Weaver. He was court-martialed, so you can actually pardon a court-martial too in 1947. He was pardoned for theft of 4 pounds of butter. Now, I don't know how good the butter is here in the Navy. Apparently, that is some good butter in the Navy. And I don't know the story of Raymond Philip Weaver, but his court-martial has been pardoned as of the 90s by President Clinton for theft of 4 pounds of butter. Holy guacamole, what is going on here? Don't steal 4 pounds of guacamole either. If you are in the if you're in the Navy. Now, for the record, these pardons are really powerful. Not only can you pardon people for, you know, convictions, for court-martials, you can do that. This is for desertion here. Anyways, you can also pardon people who aren't even alive anymore. We can go to this guy right here, a guy named Henry Ocean Flipper, if I'm saying that correctly. You must have a pretty interesting story. You can Google it on your own time. I don't know anything about it. But he was court-martialed in 1881 for conduct unbecoming an officer. That's kind of mysterious. Anyways, conduct unbecoming an officer. So President Clinton pardoned this guy despite the fact that he was sentenced in 1881 and he is certainly dead at the time that he gets pardoned. But that's what we call a posthumous pardon, right? This is something that clears his name even though he's no longer alive. The president has the ability to do this. Now, if you go back up to the very top of this pardon, obviously President Clinton is controversial in his use of the pardon power. He ends up pardoning a lot of people. I think he pardoned, don't quote me on this, I haven't done the math, but I think he pardoned more people than the following 3 presidents combined. He pardoned a lot of people. But no pardons were more controversial than these pardons. The pardons on January 20th, 2001. Ask yourself, why would that date be such a controversial date for pardons? And the truth of the matter is, it's controversial because it's the last day of his presidency. This happens with every president. The last thing they do before they vacate the Oval Office is they sign a bunch of dubious pardons, and then they skip out the door in a hurry. Bush, Obama, Trump, certainly Clinton. But what sets Clinton apart from the rest, let's click on that date. Look how many people he pardons on his last day in office. That is a ridiculous list. And again, we can stop anywhere. Racketeering, mail fraud, cocaine importation. Lots of cocaine on this list here. Operating a common carrier while under the influence of alcohol. Absent without leave from the Air Force. Fraud. False claims to the Veterans Administration. More cocaine. You get the idea, okay? Theft of mail. So he issues a lot of pardons on his last day in office. And so many so that even though he's not president anymore, there is a gigantic outcry from the public about an abuse of pardon power. So much so that Clinton himself issues an editorial the following month. This is his editorial in the New York Times. It's called My Reasons for the Pardons by William Jefferson Clinton. Now, I'm going to read part of this article to you. Let me shrink this down a little bit. I'm going to read part of this article to you because it's kind of illustrative of what we talk about when we talk about the power of the pardon. Anyways, I am now officially reading in Bill Clinton's voice. Because of the intense scrutiny and criticism of the pardons of Mark Rich and his partner Pincus Green, and because legitimate concerns have been raised, I want to explain what I did and why. First, I want to make some general comments about pardons and commutations. Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president broad and unreviewable power to grant reprieves and pardons for all offenses against the United States. The Supreme Court has ruled that the pardon power is granted and it is granted without limit. That is true. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes declared that a pardon is the determination of the ultimate authority, that the public welfare will be better served by the pardon. That is true. But folks, this is where it gets weird. A president may conclude that a pardon or commutation is warranted for several reasons. The desire to restore full citizenship rights, including voting, to people who have served their sentences and lived within the law ever since. That's important to note because, as you may know, even if you've been convicted and you've served your time in prison, and now you're out of prison, you've served your debt to society, in most parts of the country, you don't get your right to vote back. So sometimes, in extraordinary circumstances, the president may pardon you after you've served your sentence so that you can get your voting rights back as a way of saying thank you for serving your debt to society and coming back and being a productive member of society. Now, on top of that, the president may also pardon somebody for a belief that a sentence was excessive or unjust. You see this under Obama a little bit. We'll talk about that in a minute. Personal circumstances that warrant compassion or other unique circumstances. What? What are we talking about here? What's going on here? Well, you start getting a feel for what President Clinton means here when you look at the list of the pardons that he granted. Because even though one state in particular is a pretty small state, you see it pop up on this list a lot, and that's Arkansas. Arkansas, 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 Arkansas. So you get the idea. A lot of these folks are from Arkansas. A lot of them were convicted in the 80s and 90s. Guys, if you don't already know, President Clinton was governor of Arkansas before he became president. A lot of these convictions from the 80s and 90s. He probably knows a lot of these guys that he's pardoning. Now, on top of that, there's at least a couple people we know President Clinton knows, such as Roger Clinton, who's related to the president, convicted in Arkansas in the 80s for conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Or Robert Clinton Fain, related to the president, convicted in Arkansas in 1982 for assisting in the preparation and filing of a false corporate tax return. So I've had students ask me before, and there are more technical answers to this as to like, how do you get a pardon in front of the president? How do you get pardoned by a president? Well, at least the shortcut answer is, it helps if you know the guy. It helps if you're related to the guy. All right, let's keep on talking. So we know that the president has pardon power, but the president also has the power of commutations. Now, President Clinton, presidents will issue these commutations quite a bit, but really what they mean is they are not pardons, not full pardons. Instead, they're kind of partial pardons. Really what they do is they can lessen a sentence. They can lessen a penalty. If you have to pay $1 million, the president can commute it down to 150,000 or something like that. Or if you're sentenced to life, the president can pardon it down to 25 years or anything like that. The president can do that. He can lessen a sentence. Now, President Obama actually issued a ton of commutations. Not that many pardons, but a lot of commutations, primarily for drugs, because he felt that drug crimes are harshly sentenced. And so while he wouldn't undo the convictions, he reduced the sentences for a lot of them. 7 presidential duties. These are written in the text of Article 2, but there are other powers the president has that are less official. One of those is legislation. Whoop, I'm sorry, my head is. One of those is legislation. The president has power over legislation. Now again, he does not make laws, but he has a lot of influence over lawmaking, and that's thanks to the veto. That's thanks to the veto. The veto is the ability, as you know, for the president to shut down laws. And so what the president will often do is he'll talk to Congress and say, hey, that law that you're working on, cut it out. Because if you get it to me, I'm going to veto it. You know, again, he can't force Congress to stop, but he can dissuade them from working on it, because that's a lot of work for no gain. No thanks. You know, I'm putting a lot of work in on this particular bill. The president's just going to veto it anyways. So again, the president is wielding a lot of influence over lawmaking here. Now, on top of that, the president also gives big fancy speeches a couple times a year to try to influence the public. Sometimes he can't influence Congress directly, but he can influence voters if he gives a good fancy speech. Once a year, usually in February, he gives something called a State of the Union address. And the State of the Union address is where he talks about all the good things my presidency has done, but he also talks about what he wants to see Congress working on for the coming year. He'll make a big sales pitch for it, and if he convinces enough Americans who watch the speech, Americans can apply pressure on their members of Congress, and then Congress will start working on certain things. So the president does have a lot of ability to steer the direction Congress is going. Not only can he influence them and steer them, he can also directly negotiate with them. The president will oftentimes straight up negotiate with Congress when it comes to certain pieces of legislation. He can do that. Now, he can't write the final deal, but if Congress comes to him and says, please don't veto this piece of legislation, maybe we can work out a deal. So the president and Congress will talk to each other. Okay, take this out, put this in, and I won't veto it. And so long as he doesn't write the final version of the bill, that's okay. So none of this is in the Constitution, but it is the very, well, I guess the State of the Union, he is mandated by the Constitution to give a speech. But nonetheless, these are all informal powers, all informal influences he has over lawmaking. I'll give you 1 minute on that. Okay, let's keep trucking. Now, this is the slide that got me in trouble here. I will not be playing how a bill becomes a law. How a bill does not become a law, an SNL skit. Instead, I'll link it under this lecture. You're seeing the video right here under this lecture. Feel free to click on it if you want, but I'm not playing it in this video because I got struck down by the YouTube gods. I've never had a video rejected before. I'm flabbergasted that that happened to me. But anyways, let's talk about special powers that only the president has. There are a few that only the president has. They are powers that he can wield single-handedly, and they can be controversial. Now, among these is emergency powers, which has the exact definition that you think it would. It is the ability of the president to have certain powers during emergencies, which, by the way, he declares. The president can declare emergencies. Anything from like a national drought to a hurricane approaching to, any number of things that could constitute an emergency, where the president can cut through red tape if you need to. Like, for instance, if there's a hurricane approaching the East Coast and several cities are trying to evacuate, but there's some legal ramifications of certain actions they're trying to take and they don't want to get in trouble, the president can just jump in directly and say, everybody stop with these ridiculous legal ramifications, get everybody out, I'll deal with the fallout. That is an emergency power the president has. They're poorly defined, by the way. These emergency powers are poorly defined. Essentially, it gives the president a blank slate. And so sometimes they can be very controversial. For instance, Donald Trump declared a national emergency at the southern border, and then he directed military funding billions of dollars from the military to aid in some construction of some of a border wall. That is controversial because some people were like, well, is that really a national emergency? Maybe, maybe not. There's a big debate over that and whether it was a proper use of funds. That is a very normal thing. These emergency powers can be very controversial. Now, on top of that, we need to take some time to talk about executive orders, and this is where I would play my YouTube clip that now has gotten me in trouble, so I'm not going to not going to play it. But instead, let's take some time to talk about executive orders because a lot of Americans think the president could just make laws however he wants, whenever he wants, through executive order. Executive order does sound a little bit, just through a cursory understanding, that the president could just do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. So let's make sure we understand what the heck executive orders are. What are they? Well, here's your definition. They are rules issued by the president unilaterally. Unilaterally is a fancy way of saying by himself. They are rules issued unilaterally by the president that have the effect of law. They have the effect of law. So, some of you might think, does that just mean the president can make whatever rules on whatever he wants, whenever he wants? That he has essentially lawmaking powers by another name? No, guys, that's not true. Executive orders, that's not what they can do. Executive orders cannot make their own law. What is the president in charge of? The president is in charge of enforcing the law. So all of his executive orders can only be about enforcement. How are we going to enforce existing law? How are we going to enforce existing constitutional provisions and existing treaties? Matter of fact, we'll talk about this a little bit in Chapter 11, but the executive orders can also make rules for agencies to follow. We'll talk about that in Chapter 11, so if that sounds like Greek to you, don't worry about that now. But essentially, he can make rules for the agencies to follow. Agencies are in the executive branch, so he can boss them around. But the president can't make executive orders that overrule legislation. Okay? You can't overrule legislation. You can't even make your own rules out of thin air. Instead, executive orders are only about law enforcement. With that in mind, they can be controversial too. This is when I would play this clip for you. You're welcome to watch it down below. But essentially, President Obama, for instance, issued an executive order on immigration that said when it comes to illegal immigration, we have a law in America that says if you are in America illegally, you should be deported. That's what the law says. You are eligible for deportation. And the Obama administration, Obama, through executive order, can't undo that. He can't undo it. And if you look at his deportation numbers, didn't seem to have any interest in doing that. But he did issue an executive order. And that executive order said, if you've been in America a certain amount of time and you've been here peacefully, you are not a violent offender, then we're just going to deprioritize your deportation. We're going to deprioritize it so much that you might as well not worry about it. Well, you know, that is essentially what this skit is about. You're free to watch it now. I'll pause. Okay. But anyways, that is, once again, those executive orders will sometimes end up in front of the Supreme Court, as Obama's did, and the Supreme Court actually shot it down. They said that just comes too close to overruling the law. Agree, disagree, you know, you can see how these things can be controversial. Another presidential power is what we call executive privilege. The president can issue, can claim executive privilege. And that means that from time to time, he doesn't have to tell Congress what he knows. He doesn't have to tell the courts what he knows, because that would put it in the public domain, and I don't want to do that because I want to protect American national security. That's a good thing. I think most of us probably agree that's a good thing that the president doesn't do that. Protects national security, but it can be controversial, right? Because sometimes the president may not just may not share it because they don't want to share something, even though it has no effect on national security, but they'll still claim that it has national security ramifications. So that could be controversial as well. Give you 1 minute on that. Darn you, SNL clip. Darn you. You are the reason why I'm here right now. If it wasn't for you. All right, with that in mind, let's move on, shall we, and talk about what happens. All those things you saw a moment ago were controversial. What if the president is more than merely controversial? What if they're abusing their power? and they need to be removed. This is a relevant conversation for us here in 2021 because the previous president we had, I'll show you here in a minute, the previous president we had was impeached twice. We'll talk about that in just a second. But anyways, what happens if the president removes their powers? Guys, this right here, this is why you're taking this class, because too many Americans have no idea what it takes to remove a president from office. If I ask the average American who isn't taking this class, what does it take to remove a president from office? What are they going to say? They're going to say, well, Congress impeaches him and he's gone. That's not true. That's not true. The previous president got impeached twice. The only president in American history to have been twice impeached, but served out his full first term, right? The only reason he left office is because we voted him out back in 2020. Now, for the record, this person I did quote just now is half right. Who's in charge of removing the president from office? Congress is in charge of that. So whoever said Congress impeaches him and he's gone, they're half right. Congress is in charge of removing him from office. But like I said, Congress voted twice, or at least part of Congress did, to remove this guy from office. 2 times impeached. 2 times impeached. One for trying to get a foreign government to dig up dirt on his opponent, and a second time for encouraging the January 6th riots at the beginning of this year. So twice impeached, but neither time removed from office. How is that possible? Let's break it down. First of all, let's get into impeachment, because again, Congress actually doesn't impeach the president. Only part of Congress does. Congress is only the House is in charge of impeachment, and impeachment doesn't remove the president from office, obviously. It is only the first step in removal. Now, it only takes a simple majority of the House of Representatives. This happened 2 times in the last year and a half of the Trump administration. And impeachment, like I've said like 3 times already, it doesn't remove the president from office. It's merely the House of Representatives saying, we're pretty sure the president has done something wrong here. I'm pretty sure he did something wrong, and as a result, we should have a trial. Now, of course, if the simple majority, if the House is what's needed to impeach the president, it's the Senate that holds the trial. Now, I don't care if you know that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides, that should say presides, over the case. But nonetheless, that's true. And essentially, you're going to have some people from the House, what they call impeachment managers, and you're going to have some lawyers for the president. They'll both make the case as to why the president must or must not be removed from office. And the Senate acts as essentially 100 jurors, and they will vote as to whether the president should be removed or not. And this is how Trump got out of it, because despite the fact that a majority of Congress voted both times that he should be impeached and removed, a majority isn't enough. It takes 2/3 of the Senate to agree whether you have abused your power and need to go, or whether you stay. It takes 2/3 to agree that you need to go. If that happens, of course, VPOTUS, or Vice President of the United States, takes over. But yeah, 2 times convicted. 2 times impeached, but 0 times convicted. He was acquitted both times by the Senate, even though a majority of the Senate voted to remove him both times. It couldn't get up to the 2/3 threshold, not even close, really. All right, the last conversation I want to have in this chapter is the fact that presidents rely on advisors. Presidents are usually, guys, smart people, usually. Presidents are usually smart people. Not always, but even if they're freaking brilliant, though, they need help from people to help make. There's just no way that a president can know everything about everything. So he needs advisors to help him make many decisions. And what I want to do is run through a list of some of these advisors, see who's seen their power go up over time and who's seen their power go down. Let's talk about it. First, let's start in the home with the First Lady, only known as the First Lady because our presidents have only been men. Eventually, you would imagine that we'll have a female president in your lifetime, and when that happens, we'll have a First Gentleman. And so it'll be FGOTUS, but right now it's FLOTUS, First Lady of the United States. And historically, she's seen her influence go up, and that's because women used to have no rights, really, in America. And now they have rights. And now, how involved are First Ladies? It depends. From First Lady to First Lady. Right now, Jill Biden is pretty influential. She is one of the key reasons why Joe Biden has pushed so hard for tuition-free community college. But you go past Jill Biden to Melania Trump. Melania Trump, not really involved, not really that involved in which is her choice, obviously, in the president and what the president's doing. Then you go back to Michelle Obama, a little involved. Then First Lady Laura Bush, not really involved, kind of does her own thing, some charity work. And then Hillary Clinton under the Clinton administration was extremely, extremely influential. But historically, if you want to go back a couple centuries, first ladies have seen their influence go up. You don't need to know who the first lady is, but you need to know who the vice president is. Do you know who the current vice president is? It is Kamala Harris. Right here, there she is. By the way, the first woman to ever be vice president in American history. I just don't feel like enough is made about that. Like her or hate her or have no opinion on her or whatever, but she's the first woman to ever occupy that office. Her husband, by the way, is the second gentleman of the United States, so he's SCOTUS, but this is V POTUS right here, Kamala Harris. Now, for the record, vice presidents have two constitutional responsibilities. Make sure you know there are two constitutional responsibilities. Responsibility number one, keep a pulse, stay alive, because you never know what's going to happen. Sometimes the president dies, sometimes the president resigns, sometimes the president undertakes life-threatening surgery. And if that happens, the vice president will swear in for however long the surgery is, and then the president will swear back in when the procedure is over. But anyways, take over for the president if needed to. And they have a role, as we talked about in Chapter 9, as president of the Senate. Although president of the Senate doesn't really have any official responsibilities except for breaking ties. The vice president doesn't even get votes in the Senate unless there's a tie. Now, historically, vice presidents have seen their influence go up. And that's because the infrastructure around who the vice president is has changed. Now, if you go far back in American history, for the first few presidents we had, the vice president was actually the runner-up to the presidency. So whoever finished in second place, kind of like Miss America, whoever was the first runner-up, if Miss America could not fulfill the obligations of her tiara, it passes to the runner-up. And so that's what the vice president was historically. But could you imagine that now? That would be so dysfunctional. President Joe Biden with Vice President Donald Trump. I mean, Trump would try to undercut him at every step, right? As you could understand. So as a result, we've moved away from this system a good long time ago. And now effectively the rules have been changed to where the vice president now runs with the president as a running mate. In the presidential election. So did you vote in 2020? Did you vote? Who'd you vote for? Did you vote for Joe Biden? No, you didn't. Technically, you did not vote for Joe Biden. You voted for a combo ticket of Biden and Harris. Did you vote for Donald Trump in 2020? Is that how you voted? No, you didn't. You technically voted for a combo ticket of Trump and Pence. Anyways, historically, vice presidents have seen their power go up, and this is why. Now, what we classically know as the greatest advising body on the president is the cabinet. And the influence of the cabinet has kind of changed over time, but we'll get to that in a second. First of all, what is the cabinet? It's kind of like the elite crew of advisors that the president personally selects to advise him on a variety of issues. It's going to be, you don't need to know these examples here, but it's going to be like every secretary of a federal department, which we'll talk about in Chapter 11. It's going to be like the vice president, the heads of several key agencies, the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military, and so on. Lots of very important, powerful people will serve on the cabinet. Now, oddly enough, the president has seen his influence, the cabinet has seen its influence go down. Like, we classically understand the cabinet as being the key advisory body for the president. But not really. Not really. They do not, as a whole, the cabinet does not advise the president, really don't meet that often. It's now largely photo ops where the president meets with the cabinet, says, hooray, we're doing a great job, everybody go back to your offices. Let's take a couple pictures for the press and then go back to doing our jobs. Why has this happened? Well, it's happened for a couple reasons. First of all, now the cabinet is massive. The cabinet is very large now. It's dozens of people. It used to be like, 15 people. That's hard enough. It's hard enough to get advice from 15 people collectively. I don't know if you've ever had to figure out, hey, where should we go for lunch with 8 people? That's impossible. 15 people is metaphysically, we are incapable of pulling that off. But dozens of people, forget it. It's just not possible. On top of that, the president doesn't know a lot of them. The president doesn't know a lot of these guys. As a result, even though he might have hired them, they might be perfectly qualified. That doesn't mean they're the one you're going to rely on to make the most personal and important decisions in your life. I think you have some trust for me. You have some trust that I'm qualified to be teaching this subject to you. I hope you feel that way. But that doesn't mean you're going to be contacting me every time you have life-changing professional decisions in front of you, right? So you want somebody who's qualified and seems like they know what they're doing, but you also want somebody that you know and you trust. For the record, you should contact me in case you have problems or difficult choices. I would love to hear from you, but what I'm trying to say is because the president doesn't know them, he is unlikely to reach out to them, to the entire cabinet. On top of that, a lot of people on the cabinet, you got a lot of people who are in charge of a lot of different things, and sometimes they can become what we call ambassadors for their cause, or ambassadors of their cause. Now, what that means is that they will give the president advice that benefits their part of the government, right? So if we're worried about, name it, North Korea. If we're worried about North Korea, the Secretary of State, who is in charge of diplomacy, they're going to say, we should reach out to North Korea, negotiate, find common ground, give them something, get something back, set ourselves down with a framework. Who would be in charge of negotiating with North Korea? The State Department. Okay, now the Secretary of State probably genuinely believes that. That's why you want them to be Secretary of State, but it just so happens that their advice benefits their part of the government. Now, what's your Secretary of Defense going to say? North Korea? That's how you solve that problem, right? So you get the idea. They're largely going to come at it from their own personal biases from where they work in the government. So over time, the president relies on the cabinet proper less and less and less. And as a result, who has filled that void? What the textbook calls the kitchen cabinet. That's what the textbook calls it. But I just want to be clear. Nobody calls it the kitchen cabinet. That is only something textbooks do. Textbooks call these groups of people the kitchen cabinet, and only textbooks. Nobody ever calls it the kitchen cabinet. What we call it in life is the inner circle, the president's inner circle. That's what we call it. If you ever find a news article where it's like, President Biden is meeting with his kitchen cabinet, send it to me, because nobody ever writes that. Why do textbooks insist on calling it that? But if you want to Google Biden and inner circle, that stuff's going to pop up like crazy, because that's very common for us to talk about. Only textbooks call it the kitchen cabinet. Anyways, the kitchen cabinet solves a lot of these issues that the president has with the cabinet proper. It's a smaller, more informal group of people the president knows and trusts, and he keeps them around for advice. So essentially, many of them are going to be from the cabinet. It's possible that the president will meet with the cabinet and say, hey guys, everybody here, you're all doing a great job. I'm proud of you all. Great work. Good work, everybody. But you can all go home. Hey, wait a minute. On your way out, though, I want you, and you to stick around. We got to figure out this North Korea problem. Okay, now what's the president doing? Well, he dismissed his cabinet, but he has assembled an inner circle to help him figure out this particular issue. Now, for the record, as I said a moment ago, as the cabinet's influence has gone down, the inner circle's influence has gone up. Well, I'll find out before long if this lecture lasts. Maybe I'll come back next time. I'll be in a tank top with a big gulp in my hand saying, I don't know what to do anymore to get these things accepted. But I don't think I ran afoul of any trademarks this time around. So if you have any questions about this lecture, feel free to reach out to me. In the meantime, best of luck in your preparations. Take care.